All right, guys, Pyramid Head here, coming at you, bringing you a long-awaited by some new entry into the Punisher comic reviews. I'm going to slowly ease myself into this. I'm going to do this. I think I'll do a one-shot, maybe the movie adaptation from '89, and then I'll do, I think I'll do like the 6 summer special issue since that was requested. I think I'll do that after the '89 movie adaptation. But for right now, because I just got this in the mail last week and I just finished it the other day, I'm going to be talking about the Back to the War Omnibus, which collects all of the early Punisher appearances from before he got his own book. So it goes from his first appearance in Amazing Spider-Man 129, and it covers all the way up through his first ongoing miniseries with Circle of Blood, which I reviewed ages ago, and was even better on a reread, I found. But so, yeah, I'm going to go through all this, and I know originally I said I wasn't interested in reviewing this stuff because I think I said because I just wanted to review actual Punisher books, but because this is stuff which is, foundational to the character to an extent at least, I figured it would be interesting to talk about it, and because the Omnibus came out recently, which thank God the Netflix series existed, I should say, because without Daredevil and without Punisher Netflix, we probably wouldn't be getting all these reprints. We'd be getting the Marvel Knights Omnibus, probably wouldn't have been reprinted. And Max, I don't think would ever have gotten reprinted, or at least not for a while. It would not have gotten those 2 omnibus volumes, which I haven't bought because I just rebought the trade paperbacks in the big thick form when those came out. So I'm like, I'm not going to buy those right now. And it doesn't include the other Max stuff that came out in between Ennis and Aaron, so I wasn't going to buy that. But, to get to the Back to the War Omnibus, this has a nice, interesting range of material covering about a decade, roughly. Going off of this, it's 74 through 86, so about 12 years. And I was going to go through these relatively quickly, issue by issue, because there's not a whole lot for me to talk about with some of these, because there's just not a whole lot of detail I can go into with some of these stories. But the first one is Amazing Spider-Man 129. The Punisher strikes twice, and he gets introduced. This is one of those things people kind of know, but the Punisher gets introduced, and he does not have a name yet. In fact, he doesn't have a name yet until the initial miniseries by Stephen Grant, and there's actually an introduction to the volume by him, which I'll talk about a bit later when we get to... Basically, once we get to Circle of Blood, it's already reviewed. Instead of talking too in-depth about that, I'll talk about some of the stuff he says in that introduction. But basically what it is that the Punisher is hired by the Jackal, who is a Spider-Man villain whom I am aware of, and it seems like at this point in the comic, Spider-Man doesn't even know the Jackal is a thing yet. And he hires the Punisher saying, oh, Spider-Man's a murderer, he works for the criminal underworld, so go take this guy out for me. What's really interesting about this issue is that it's definitely a striking introduction to the Punisher. You just see him in that costume, it's like, ooh, who's this guy? And it's interesting because it seems to take place in just this kind of bizarre period in Spider-Man's history where Gwen Stacy has just died, and the Green Goblin has just died, and people think that Spider-Man killed Norman Osborn because no one knows that Norman Osborn is the Green Goblin. And so that's why the Punisher is partly convinced. And so he's in this weird place where I think he's kind of dating Mary Jane, but not really because he's still not over Gwen Stacy. Well, actually, I don't think he is yet. I think because it skips ahead a few issues. I think he gets together with her for a little while later on in the omnibus. But so it's basically him and Punisher fight. And then Punisher realizes he's been duped by the Jackal, and so he basically lets Spider-Man go. And also, you get the idea that Harry Osborn's going crazy from the drugs, and he knows that Spider-Man killed his father, but he's also learning. I think he's in the process of learning across these few issues here that Peter Parker is Spider-Man. And for an introduction to the Punisher, it's definitely striking. It's an interesting look. And it gives you, and he was very much the type of character who was popular in the 70s with vigilante movies and all that, like Death Wish. So it makes sense that they would do that. What's interesting about him here is that they actually introduced the idea of him having an armorer, only instead of it being Microchip, it's a guy called Rice who then gets killed by the Jackal to try and help frame Spider-Man. And also, one thing about the Jackal I find really funny is that his costume makes him look like he is stark fucking naked. Like, if there weren't, like, slight creases around his waist, you would think that this guy was just naked and had no penis. I wonder about the Punisher, who looks at this dude dressed up like, he doesn't even look like a jackal, he just looks like a furry. And it's like, who looks at this guy and goes, this guy, he's on the up and up. I'm going to believe everything he has to say about Spider-Man. It's kind of a funny way to introduce the character. And also, I do like the idea of it is just interesting to see that Punisher has an armorer, a guy who provides him with his stuff this early on. Because usually you see the hero start off and he's all alone and he kind of accrues a supporting cast as it goes along. But Punisher starts off with kind of a support network, loses it, gets microchip, loses that. And as he goes on, he just ends up more and more on his own. I find that interesting because like that earlier on he had supporting cast, but then he just loses it, especially when Garth Ennis takes over. And so the next story is a two-parter where the first part is basically Peter Parker is on this day cruise on the Hudson and it gets taken over by this terrorist guy called the Tarantula. And so he has to stop it. And there's this thing where he runs out of web fluid. And so he has to go back to his apartment and get more. And so Spider-Man actually hitchhikes, which is hilarious. And so he has to go back. I think he is actually kind of sort of dating Mary Jane at this point because it skips ahead to 134. So that's like 5-ish issues. But no, so basically he gets his webbing, he heads back to the fucking boat, and then the Punisher shows up. He goes, aha, I knew you were a bad guy all along. Obviously you're working with this tarantula guy, and blah, 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 and stuff like that. Then they sort of like, the Punisher sort of gets convinced that I guess that he's on the up and up, and they eventually start working together to take down Tarantula. Which is weird seeing these two work together because they generally sort of end up on the outs with each other. And I think he actually does, like the Punisher is when he comes in and gives Tarantula like a backstory. He talks about his history and stuff like that. And then he's been kind of tracking this guy for a little while. I find that pretty interesting. Maybe I'm confusing that with one of the other stories, but I find it interesting that like this is a character who apparently has been in comics before and the Punisher knows all about him. And also one of the things that's established pretty early on here is, but even in that first issue, is that the Punisher is a former Marine, but that's really all you get in terms of backstory. But he just says, "Oh, I have my reasons for wanting to kill all the criminals, but they're my reasons. I'm not going to tell you about them." Whereas when you get to the Punisher solo books, he will inner monologue about his family to no end, at least once per issue. It's kind of funny. But so yeah, that's a decent two-part story, pretty good for 70s comics. And I should mention these first several stories all written by Jerry Conway. And then we move on to Giant Size Spider-Man number 4. And this is one where it's Punisher and Spider-Man are working together against this group who are making biochemical weapons and kidnapping people and basically taking them to this place down. I think it's South America somewhere to test the chemical weapons on them. It's being led up by this guy called Moses Magnum. And there's this whole thing where, and they are actually working together. And what's funny is that Spider-Man is fighting like gang members at the beginning of this. And then one of them is like trying to sneak up behind him and then gets shot and killed with a sniper round. And it turns out it was the Punisher. And Spider-Man is surprisingly chill about this, considering in more modern comics, people get within 2 feet of the Punisher and they're like, "You killed somebody, you monster, what the fuck?" And here Spider-Man's just like, whatever, which is kind of fun. And there's this whole thing where like Spider-Man gets captured, and apparently this was planned because the Punisher like put like prosthetics on his face to make him not look like Peter Parker. Which is like he still looks like Peter Parker, just slightly different the way he's drawn. It's honestly kind of funny how his face just looks slightly more lined and his hair is a little bit different. He's like, "Oh, I look nothing like Peter Parker thanks to the plastic moldings the Punisher gave him," as he says. Also, an early thing that's introduced even now is Punisher's War Journal, where he's dictating his battle reports and like his record of like the criminals he goes after. Also, I'm looking at a page right now where gas gets unleashed in the camp that they're in, and like Punisher gives Spider-Man like a breather, which he puts over his mask. So you've got Spider-Man in full costume with like a rebreather over his mask. I have no idea how that's supposed to work. But yeah, Moses Magnum, that's pretty funny. But the whole idea of the War Journal, which shows up in his later books. In fact, he had a book called War Journal, which I still haven't gotten around to reading, which is kind of a shame. I really should have gotten around to that by this point, but I've been taking way too long. But I find it interesting that even this early on, this is here. And sometimes it's called different things. Like it's called like a combat diary in one part. And so you're getting like different ideas of what's going on. And so, yeah, and so you get basically just a Punisher Spider-Man team up. Also, what he does to Moses Magnum is just harsh. He basically locks him inside a room with his own chemical weapon. You actually see him melt to death on the last page of the issue, which is just gruesome looking. I'm like, damn, they were selling this stuff to kids in the 70s? Shit. And so that's the last of the initial Spider-Man appearance. There's some more Spider-Man appearances after this, but Following this up is Marvel Preview number 2, which was a black and white Marvel magazine. Now, I talked a little bit about this in the Screenplay Archaeology episode, but what the Marvel magazines were, they were black and white publications that Marvel was putting out as a way of trying to circumvent the comics code. And they experimented a lot with this, and the big, really successful one was Savage Sword of Conan, which ironically was most recently reprinted by Dark Horse. But that was a really good, solid comic, and definitely, although apparently that really fell off by the end. I've not gotten anywhere near that point. But apparently it went straight through from the mid-70s to the mid-90s, and apparently somewhere in the 80s it just went to crap from what I've heard. But so we get another story of the Punisher, but it's in Marvel Preview number 1. And once again, written by Jerry Conway. This is the final one written by him. Earlier on, the art had been done by Ross Andrew, who gave like Punisher this really distinct widow's peak and like Spock eyebrows, which I always thought was kind of funny. But in this one, it's once again written by Jerry Conway, and the art is by Tony DeZuniga, who was a incredibly talented artist who also worked on Conan from time to time. And he was really good in that, and he does a great job here. Just really stunning black and white art. And the story in this one is that the Punisher, who still hasn't been given a name, looking to stop an assassination against this political figure, and he shoots this sniper. It turns out to be a guy he knew in Vietnam. So that idea of him having like an old acquaintance from Vietnam as a character in the book, that starts here pretty much. And so he begins going around looking. There's this whole storyline about these different assassinations that are going on, and there's this whole plan behind it where everybody's getting killed and taken down, and there's this FBI agent who's following him around. He's pulled the Punisher's file, and he says that, he was an ex-Marine captain who's now considered a deserter, and the Marines are really touchy about it because they don't like the idea of one of their own is now going around being a vigilante, which is interesting that the Marines would be touchy about that. Although it is kind of weird that they are studiously against saying what his name was, so I guess they hadn't decided on a name or just wanted him to be a mysterious, nameless character. That's actually a pretty interesting... This is where you get the origin story, a shorter version. We get an expanded up version of it in the next issue, but you see, they're in Central Park and they stumble across a mob hit where for some reason they've like hung a guy upside down from a tree. And the way it's described here, it seems like they opened fire on them and somehow all the family members got hit and killed, but Frank didn't get hit at all, even though he's not called Frank yet, but you get the idea. It's like, wow, they're at like point blank range too. Like, how did you miss this guy? Just wonky stuff I love about comics. But he goes and like he finds the family of one of the assassins, and he actually saves them from the bad guys who tried to kill them. And that's a good scene. And I honestly can't even remember what the story was in this one, if I'm being honest. I just remember it being a pretty strong one. And it's this guy who's trying to make like these giant guns and stuff. They're trying to overthrow the government, basically. It's this group of like industrial people who are trying to overthrow the government. That's basically what the plot ends up being. And of course, the Punisher goes and like stops and kills them all. And it's implied that like this FBI agent is going to keep pursuing Frank, but he never comes back over the course of the story. It's like he never comes back at all. And I guess that's because Jerry Conway stops writing these. But it's an interesting, it was actually a pretty strong little action piece. And moving on to Marvel Super Action, which was it was supposed to be a new ongoing, but they talk about, there's like a whole introduction here to it, an editorial where they talk about how there was like, because of like the economy, they couldn't afford to make another ongoing, so they decided to continue it based on sales. And of course, because I don't think there was any more of these with the Punisher, I guess they didn't get the response they needed. And so this one is written by Archie Goodwin, who was a common fixture of Marvel at the time, and the art this time is Tony DeZuniga and Rico Raval doing the finishes of the pencil work. Once again, very evocative black and white art. And in this one, the Punisher, he hires a prostitute, and she asks him, why are you so moody? And so he tells the story once again of how his family got killed, and one of the hitmen was Bruno Costa. And so we get this big, long story about how the cops couldn't do anything about what was going on, so he took it into his own hands and became the Punisher, and he goes and he hunts down all these guys, and eventually he has to go to Florida to hunt down Bruno Costa, who's the brother of Frank Costa, the head of the crime family, and like the guys, and like the last two guys who were involved in the hit that killed his family, they're holed up in this mansion in Florida, and he goes there and he goes to kill them all, but then And once again, Punisher stories can take place in Florida, guys. I don't know why that's a problem for some people. He goes there, and he actually, like, kills a dude with a shark, which is just bizarre. And then, like, he finds Bruno Costa has been killed by somebody before he gets there. And then he says that someone got Frank Costa as well. And he's... Okay, let me see if I got this right. Yeah, and he realizes, oh, there were girls at the mansion in Florida and in New York when he went after Frank Costa. So then he just... The prostitute tries to stab him, and then he shoots her, realizing she's the hit woman. And I'm like, damn, that's cold. And that's such a cool way to end it. And so that ends the Punisher's flirtation with the black and white magazine format, and we're back in Amazing Spider-Man 161 through 162. Now, this is going to be easy to go through because the first half of this is just kind of Spider-Man meeting Nightcrawler, and the whole setup is that Nightcrawler, he hears about an old friend of his from the circus got killed by a sniper, and so he goes to New York to figure out what's going on. There's this whole thing apparently about how the new X-Men members aren't known to the public or something, and I haven't read a whole lot of 70s X-Men, so I can't really explain that to you. But so he has to keep things secret, and so Spider-Man doesn't know who he is, and for just bizarre, convoluted reasons, Nightcrawler thinks that Spider-Man is the sniper. I guess because he buys into the Daily Bugle bullshit. And so they end up fighting, and it's really kind of contrived. And then the Punisher shows up, and there's talk about how, like, the sniping matches the Punisher's MO and stuff like that. And so, oh, is it him? But then it turns out he says it's not him. And the big twist is that the sniper is, wait for it, classic Punisher villain Jigsaw in his first appearance. And what honestly should have been his last appearance based on what we see here. He has this, it ends in this big confrontation, and he monologues about how Punisher took out his gang and then tossed him through a window and screwed up his face, and now I call myself Jigsaw, and I hate you, blah, blah, blah. But what's funny is that this is the guy who goes on to be known as Punisher's archenemy. Punisher doesn't even take him down in this first issue. Spider-Man, like, knocks him, like, squirts him with a fire hose and knocks him down and then ties him up with the hose. And so that's why he doesn't die. And then, like, Punisher is walking away, and he's like, the funny thing is, I don't even remember this guy. So he totally M. Bison's that shit. And so it's like, this guy is known as the Punisher's arch enemy. Why exactly? Is it because he's the only Punisher villain, or one of the few who doesn't really die? I don't know, but that was just kind of so fun. And these, by the way, are written by Len Wein, who created Swamp Thing, and is a comic writer I generally like. And he also writes this next set of issues, where there's like this terrorist group, and they're upset at... They're a very 70s terrorist group, something Liberation Front, and they're upset at J. Jonah Jameson for writing editorials against them, because guess what? He's actually a good journalist. And there's this whole side plot with Harry Osborn and his psychiatrist, who I think is the third Green Goblin, if I'm remembering his comic book history correct. And so they hired this guy called the Hitman, who apparently is an established villain Spider-Man has met before, to go after and kidnap J. Jonah Jameson so they can get rid of him in their own way. And then the Punisher shows up to try and stop the Hitman at the same time as Spider-Man, and that gives Hitman enough time to get away with Jameson in his weird little mini helicopter thing. And so then so the next issue is them teaming up. And I want to say this is where the whole concept of mercy bullets are introduced, just in between pages. Suddenly Spider-Man's like, oh, I forced him to use mercy bullets, which are basically bullets that don't kill you, they just knock you out. I don't know how that works. And Punisher here says that, Hitman is this guy that he knew in Vietnam and saved his life, and so he feels like he owes him, but he knows who he is. And eventually it turns out that this terrorist group has rigged the Statue of Liberty to blow, and they want to set J. Jonah Jameson on top to go up in the explosion. And so you have Spider-Man and the Punisher fighting these terrorists, and they end up fighting the Hitman on top of the roof. And pretty much what happens is that both Spider-Man and Hitman are hanging off, and Hitman's like, Punisher, you owe me a life. And then Punisher is like, he seems kind of conflicted about for like a split second, and then goes and gets Spider-Man. And it actually says in the narration captions, it was a question that didn't truly deserve answering. And so Hitman slips and falls, and you see his crumpled body at the base of the Statue of Liberty. Is like, and it's just kind of like, that was kind of funny. So yeah, that was an okay sort of team up story between him and Spider-Man. The whole mercy bullets thing is super fucking stupid, but whatever. And the next one is Captain America 241, written by Mike W. Barr, who also wrote Camelot 3000 is a comic I like a lot, and it's called Fear Grows in Brooklyn. This was interesting to me mainly on the level of I have never read solo Captain America before, and I didn't know it was this strange. He just hangs around in Brooklyn running around fighting muggers, and then like we see him like trying to get a job as a commercial artist, so the Reb Brown movie is closer to Captain America comics than I thought it was. And there's like this weird job interview he has with this woman who's like a one-person publishing outfit. And then like we see like the apartment he lives in with all these guys, and there's like a Holocaust survivor that he saved in World War II. And I'm guessing the guys down, I don't know if they're meant to be a gay couple, but I kind of got that impression just a little bit. I don't mean to be ignorant or anything, but it just came off a little bit like that to me. And I'm like, I didn't know like starving artist Captain America who just lives among people was something that was from the comics. But no, Captain America runs into the Punisher, who's chasing down this guy who's like a snitch who's turning against the mob or something, who knows where this special meeting is going down. And like Captain America doesn't want him to kill anybody and blah, blah, blah. And he eventually stops the Punisher from shooting up all these bad guys. And it turns out that there was like a federal agent embedded among them or something. And so it's like, oh, good thing you didn't kill anybody, blah, blah, blah. And it was not that great of an issue, but it was just weird seeing what Captain America's 70s status quo was like. And I believe at that point, we're in like 79, 80 already, so we've already gone through 6 years of the Punisher. And so then we come back to Spider-Man, Amazing Spider-Man, 201 to 20, I think it's 201 to 202. Let me check real quick. Check the table of contents. Flip the page, jackass. Okay, yeah, it's 201 to 202. And this is a two-part story where pretty much there's this mob boss that's on trial, like a drug lord who escapes, who arranges his escape, and then Punisher is still using his mercy bullets, which is dumb. Pretty much what it is, it's like weird. Peter Parker's working for a new newspaper. There's this weird sidetrack about J. Jonah Jameson having like a nervous breakdown or something, which I don't fully understand what's going on there. I don't really know enough about it because it's just the middle of an ongoing story. And Punisher is especially gunning for this guy because there was like this Turkish kid that he befriended and brought to America who became a narcotics agent and then got killed by this guy. And that seemed kind of forced to give yet another personal revenge motive to the Punisher, I thought. And so it basically just ends where it's like, he wants to kill the guy, but then Spider-Man interrupts him, and the guy ends up getting accidentally run over by his own man. And there's just a scene of him getting slammed by this car into a street lamp, which is just so funny looking. It's just, and the sound effect is literally whomp. It's just ridiculous. And I want to say this is the same issue where you see like the drug dealers literally going to a playground and handing out drugs to little kids. Let me see if I can find, yeah, there it is. Because his reporter partner who doesn't like him, Peter's reporter partner who doesn't like him tries to go undercover with these guys. And they go to a playground. They're literally handing out packets of cocaine to little kids. Like, seriously, did people ever actually do that in history? I don't think so. But it was an okay two-parter, but the revenge thing wasn't much. And then we get the Amazing Spider-Man Annual 15, the king-size annual. And there's this kind of funny running gag about how they can't make up their mind what the front page is going to be. And Doc Ock is like threatening to like use this special kind of poison and like poison half the city, and he wants it, and he's going to do it to make sure that they know he's serious, and he's going to threaten to do it again so he can get his ransom. And both Punisher and Spider-Man get on his trail. And pretty much what has that, there's actually a really clever twist where it turns out that Doc Ock is going to poison the ink at the Daily Bugle because that reaches exactly 5 million people, which I think is actually pretty cool because that's the exact number he said would die. And basically what happens is that Punisher just barely gets out of Doc Ock's lair without drowning, but he's out of mercy bullets, and so the cops arrest him for his first term in prison. And this is written by, this is actually written by, Marv Wolfman did 201 to 202. This is written by Dennis O'Neil, who used to work for DC and did a lot of classic Batman stuff in the 70s. It's written by Dennis O'Neil and illustrated by Frank Miller, interestingly enough. Really good art from Frank Miller, too. You know, he got kind of a reputation for bad art later on in his career, but there's really good art in this one. And of course, this prison sentence leads into the next set of issues, which is an excerpt from Daredevil 182, and then Daredevil 183 to 184, which is a crossover with Daredevil, obviously. And in this one, it's Punisher breaks out of prison. He gets broken out of prison by a federal agency to help stop this drug shipment, but then he decides to just stay out because it turns out that this gang is using kids as soldiers, and so that just makes him just give up on the deal and stay out of prison completely. And then the 2-part Daredevil story is about these guys who are selling selling PCP to kids, and we see this kid tripping out on PCP and then jumping out a window and dying immediately. And so this is some pretty dark stuff. Now, the first issue is co-written by Roger McKenzie, but Frank Miller writes it, and he also does the art, which was finished by Klaus Janson, who later goes on to do full art on the Punisher ongoing for a little while. It's actually not a bad little storyline. Like, you've got some courtroom stuff with Matt Murdock. You've got because this kid goes to kill the drug dealer that sold his sister to PCP, but he shoots over his head because he can't bear to kill him. But the guy still gets killed by a sniper round, and Daredevil has to go defend him, and he has to go find out who actually did it. And I'm like, you could take the bullet out of the guy and do a ballistics test against the bullet from the kid's gun. I mean, they did have ballistics and this is 82, I think, when this comes out. So yeah, they definitely had ballistics by that point. And it's like, I don't know, this is a little contrived, but it's a nice, moody little crime story, and definitely goes for some edgy stuff for 82. And yet, the usual, you kill Punisher, I don't, which of course makes sense for Daredevil because Daredevil is so full of that Catholic guilt thing. And what's interesting is that Daredevil finds the guy who actually killed the dealer, who's like his like partner in crime. But when he doesn't hear the guy's heart quiver in court, he decides he's innocent and decides to defend him. And so the courtroom stuff ends up turning out that the guy actually is guilty. He just had a pacemaker which threw off Daredevil's senses. It's a really strong little story for the time. It hasn't aged particularly gracefully, and there's some like ongoing Daredevil stuff I don't necessarily understand, like his girlfriend running her family's corporation, and he proposes to her, and I'm like, I don't know who this person is. It was actually an interesting, kind of thoughtful for the time story that was written, and I like that. Now, next up comes probably one of the most notorious Punisher stories before he got his ongoing, and this is Spectacular Spider-Man 81 through 83, where it's Spider-Man and Cloak and Dagger, and then the Punisher also gets introduced. The Punisher escapes from prison at the beginning of the first issue, and basically what it is that Cloak and Dagger, who I know nothing about, hardly anything, they've decided they're going to go kill the Kingpin because he's like sending drugs to the streets and stuff like that, and Spider-Man doesn't believe in killing. And also the Punisher is going after the Kingpin as well. And so pretty much he escapes from prison and actually betrays like the criminal who was working with him to escape and just lets him get captured again, which is totally a Punisher thing to do. But so Punisher is going out and going after these drug dealers, and he's feuding with Cloak and Dagger. They're not getting along. And there's this whole thing about Black Cat is in the hospital, and apparently he's in a relationship with her now. And I don't really care because I don't know a whole lot about that character. And he thinks that Cloak and Dagger killed all these junkies, but then there's like all these bullet holes in the wall that Spider-Man didn't see because he didn't take a look around. It's like, oh no, it must have been the Punisher. And then we get probably one of the worst moments of the Punisher, at least up until he turns into a black guy, which I will end up covering, sadly, eventually. Is that there's a scene of him monologuing and walking around the city, monologuing about how he must fight crime. He takes a shot at a wife beater and wounds him. He takes a shot at people who they're like using a newspaper to like cover themselves from the rain, and they chuck it at a trash can and they just miss it by inches, and he starts shooting at them. And then he sees like a taxi cab driver run a red light, and so he shoots at them. Now this storyline is written by Bill Mantlo, and according to Stephen Grant in his introduction, Bill Mantlo did not like guns, and he didn't see how anybody who went around firing one was not crazy, so he writes him as just a total crazy person here, who's not just against the mafia and organized crime and drug dealers and stuff, he's against littering and running red lights, and it's just really stupid. And eventually it ends up being he goes after the Kingpin, Cloak and Dagger go after him as well, and it ends up being Punisher one-on-one versus the Kingpin, and then the Kingpin like defeats him by literally pulling a rug out from under him and then throwing a couch at him, which is hilarious. So Kingpin gets away, Cloak and Dagger are subdued for the moment. Also, Punisher gets away by threatening Vanessa, which is kind of funny. And she stumbles into the room and she calls the Kingpin Wilbur, so I guess somebody forgot that the Kingpin's first name is Wilson. But that's a little strange. And then the third part of the story is basically just wrapping stuff up, like relationship. There's like a random action scene. There's relationship silliness with between Spider-Man and Black Cat, and then we get the Punisher going on trial, and he gets locked away for good, and he just starts ranting like a madman in the middle of the courtroom, which is admittedly pretty entertaining. And he's like going like, I'm not crazy, the justice system is crazy, blah, blah, blah. And so then they send him to prison again for the third time, because he went to prison at the end of that one Spider-Man arc, got out in Daredevil, and then went back to prison at the end of that Daredevil arc, and got out again at the beginning of the Spectacular Spider-Man. So this is where the Punisher of the original miniseries, also called Circle of Blood, comes in. Now, this starts off with them saying that Jigsaw drugged Frank, and that's why he was acting all crazy in the last few issues. And that was basically their way of retconning the stupidity of that whole scene of him shooting at litter bugs and stuff like that. And so Stephen Grant talks about in the introduction how when he first started working at Marvel in 1976, he was given an assignment to come up with ideas for comics for characters that didn't have their own yet. And one of them was the Punisher, and this was just something he didn't really want to do, but he discovered in creating his pitch that he really liked the character and wanted to do it. But Marvel just would not go for a Punisher series for 10 years, because according to the Marvel people, nobody reading Marvel cares about a guy with a gun. And then in the mid-'80s, Mike Zeck, his art gets really big as an artist because he did Secret Wars, which was the big Marvel crossover, sort of like their answer to Crisis on Infinite Earths, but it actually came out earlier because they rushed it ahead. And so that was a big seller, and he was a big celebrity artist for Marvel at the time. Like, he was the big hot thing, and so Grant talked to Mike Zeck about it, and Zeck was already a big fan of the Punisher character, so he agreed to it. And then the miniseries went out, and they said, hey, it's on your head. And the first issue came out on a Friday morning and was completely sold out by that afternoon. And I find that really fascinating that nobody wanted the Punisher, and then he became the next big thing. I think that's fascinating, the way that works out. The one character concept nobody cared about ended up being a big seller. And another thing that was interesting is that because Grant had to slightly alter his story to account for what Mantlo had done in Spectacular Spider-Man, he had to introduce an existing Punisher villain. He had to use an existing Punisher villain to explain why someone would want to drug him like that. And so they used Jigsaw, and he straight up says in the introduction, I didn't like Jigsaw, Mike didn't like Jigsaw, but he was all we had to work with because every other Punisher villain dies. Which is pretty funny. He says he basically attributes using him in that first miniseries. That's what gave Jigsaw a new lease on life as the Punisher's arch enemy, was the fact that we had to use him out of necessity. I find that utterly fascinating that was the case. That a bad guy that he didn't even like, didn't give a shit about, much like I don't really give a shit about Jigsaw, so you can change him however you want. He just used him because he had to, and that's what made Jigsaw stick around for as long as he has. In fact, if he hadn't been in that first miniseries, I'm not convinced he would have stuck around at all. I don't think there would have been any talk of, him being a big character. Like, there wouldn't have been any talk of bringing him into the movies. There wouldn't have been the whole Netflix. There would not be people complaining about Jigsaw not looking ugly enough in the Netflix series. Jigsaw would be a completely forgotten character. And that's just something I just find that really interesting too. Now, as for the miniseries, I read it. I reviewed it already once before, and it still reads really well. The best issue of it for me still is that first issue in the prison. That's just a lot of fun. Seeing Frank in an actual prison, getting like a lot more time with that as opposed to the others where he got out pretty quickly. And just seeing him interact with the criminals and seemingly ally with them, but knowing they're gonna stab him in the back. And just the way that all goes down, and seeing Jigsaw have a gun blow up in his face like a dumbass is pretty funny. And just other stuff. And the overall story arc, I like this whole idea of the Trust and Punisher's war getting out of hand because of how the Trust handles things, and the idea of the Punishvid Squad, who are like the Punisher wannabes that they set up, and are actually brainwashed to be like the Punisher, but they're still not as good as the Punisher. That's a really cool idea. It does still kind of suck that the 5th issue of the 4 is by a different artist. I'm guessing that's because they had, problems with the print run selling out, and they needed to, hurry up and make more. So I guess that's why Zeck couldn't come back for the last issue. But Mike Vosberg does a good job. And there's some interesting stuff in here, like the son of a mobster who wasn't actually part of the mob, but Frank killed his father, so he kind of gets pulled back into it and cajoled into going after the Punisher and maybe killing him, and that whole interaction they have together, and he's willing to let the Punisher take out all these bad guys and then kill him because he doesn't like the mob either. I thought that was really interesting. I thought their final confrontation was good. I thought it reminded me a little bit of what they did in the '89 movie with the kid, and he kills the kid's father, and the kid's pointing the gun at him, and he just kneels down and puts the gun to his head and goes, "Go ahead, do it." Like, that scene's great. It reminded me of that a little bit, except the guy's an adult. And then also, the way he deals with the female villain at the end, where she's teetering on the edge of this bridge in a car, and he doesn't save her, he just walks the fuck away, is so awesome. So yeah, that's The Punisher Back to the War Omnibus. Definitely a very good read. If you're a big Punisher fan like me, it's worth buying. If you're not like super into the character, it's not a necessary purchase because there's a lot of really early unformed Punisher stuff. So it's interesting seeing how the different pieces of the Punisher came together. So yeah, that's my look at the Punisher Omnibus, and until whatever video I do next, bye.